free ideal. So, on Tuesday and on Friday, Thursday, we did a thing about procedurally rational framing effects. That framing effects were very irrational. Now I can maybe not so much. We're looking forward to that lecture. I should also mention that we, at the end of the month, on the 28th of February and the 1st of March, the center is hosting a conference to be or not to be included in the causal model, which is about the question of how you select causal variables in the model. You're all invited to come. If you are planning to join the conference, please go on the center website and register. So that we can have a head count a little bit in advance to know how much coffee and breakfast we should have. Then it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Laura Gradowski. Laura got her PhD at CUNY in 2022. Then she was a postdoc here at the center. Wonderful memory of hosting Laura here. And then she worked in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science across the whole. Laura works on fringe theories, theories in science that are the margins of science, and that sometimes gets into mainstream science, but sometimes don't, like UFO. You know, we're still waiting for that great moment where we'll be told, okay, this is mainstream science, but not quite there.
Not yet, not yet.
Not yet. We should be open-minded. And in fact, being open-minded is actually one of the lessons that Laura has pushed actually for years now by looking at the phenomenon of fringe theories being included at first, sometimes decades, into mainstream science. She has published on that topic. She has a paper in studies on the topic. And also she has a co-author of Laura. So we have a joint paper with a few other people on +1 on how to measure consensus in science, and yet was a project that Laura has been involved with. Today, I think Laura wins the prize for the best title of the year. No, it doesn't come with money. I'm sorry about that. Just come with recognition. Datasets and dead assets, the missing archives of science. Laura is yours.
Thank you, Edward. Thanks everyone for joining me. And the work on the consensus ascertainment is going to come up here. So as part of this is by data sets, I'm largely referring to the data sets that are taken to be authoritative in comparison to those that are either just not included or run up against those. And basically what that involves is alignment with a consensus view or views. So today, this talk is going to be pretty exploratory. This is an idea I've had for some 5 years or something now, but it's not been fully developed. So I would love to have kind of a more open discussion afterwards. And I look forward to hearing your feedback. So I'm going to start by talking about different ways to approach having a sort of, or what I mean by a scientific archive, and different approaches to curating such an archive. And then I'm going to point out some of the reasons to be concerned about these efforts to curate a consensus. Then I'll talk a little bit about some reasons for open inclusion in such an archive, opening up an archive. And my idea on this front is to, I don't know why that happened. Well, a worldwide web of frameworks, which is, in my mind, a sort of, it's hard to call it this, but a social media platform for science, in which individuals may freely opt in and contribute their demographic information as they're willing, observations that they've had or experiences they've had, firsthand reports, and their theories or explanations for those, should they have them. And the point being to be able to sort of generate a lot of data and information from that collection of information. So I'll get into a little bit of details of what I have in mind there. But to start, I want to distinguish between what I'm calling here the Alexandrian ideal. So according to Galen and, all these people who were either there or heard about it, the Library of Alexandria, it was curated by the librarians who actually wanted to include everything. So not excluding anything, not making anything unavailable, right? And I mean, I think part of it is this idea that like simply including something, making it accessible in our current reality seems to make people think that that's somehow endorsing it or making it seem validated. So I think it's important to distinguish between inclusion in terms of allowing information or ideas, what some people might think are misinformed ideas, to get their airtime. That doesn't necessarily require accepting those ideas. So the Library of Alexandria was a vision of total inclusion. It was the dream of a universal repository of human knowledge. Whereas, as I see it, at least, science has sort of become a system of filters, various mechanisms for allowing in and keeping out certain ideas or ways of thinking or understanding the world around us. And it determines what information ends up being accessible, what gets taken seriously. And largely, I see this as maybe something that is, by and large, a very public phenomenon, insofar as these science communicators end up feeling it to be their sort of duty to push science consumers towards data that stands behind a prevailing view or prevailing views or reasonable disagreements according to what's accepted amongst people doing science in the general public. And one thing that's interesting, not going to talk too much about here, but just to flag it, that experts I've found often, like the actual experts in the field, like people who won a Nobel Prize for discovery of HIV, like Luc Montagnier, end up actually having views that are quite fringy or alternative to what most people would think are the views of experts or the prevailing views. And they don't get any less flack for being experts or being, credible people in their area. So according to lore, the Library of Alexandria was this whole archive. I mean, I think they're hard to know really what goes on. So I'm not trying to be historically accurate so much here as more emphasizing the ideal behind this. So the president of the King's Library would use the money to try to bring in manuscripts from around the world, and as many as he could get his hands on. So this is a little anecdote. By means of purchase and transcription, he carried out to the best of his ability the purpose of the king, which was to bring this archive together. And he was asked, "How many thousands of books are there in the library?" And he replied, "More than 200,000, O king. And I shall make an endeavor in the immediate future to gather together the remainder also, so that the total of 500,000 may be reached." So, I mean, numbers would be much larger today. And this is from Galen, points out that Ptolemy was so eager to collect books that he ordered the books from everyone who sailed there to be brought to him. The books were then copied into new manuscripts. He gave the new copy to the owners whose books had been brought to him after they sailed there, but he put the original copies in the library with the inscription, "A book from the ships." Which is cool. It also is sort of reminiscent of some of Friar Ben's ideas with regard to the ancients being much more accepting of, accepting is, I don't want to use that word, much more tolerant, and that's the word he uses, towards views that were just totally alternative to whatever it was that they adopted, and that being like totally fine, like not a big deal. Of course, things don't work so much like that today, at least not in every area. So part of what I see happening is there being these different sort of forces or mechanisms that undergird consensus and help us sort of create consensus, or at least the system and the systems in place seem to be pretty much geared towards streamlining views. So just some examples of what I have in mind here. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but like databases, which are going to determine the sorts of research that is included in a global record and to whom it is accessible. So there's paywalls for people who do not have a affiliation with an institution that provides that access. Then there are, of course, well-known journal peer review is a way of filtering out approaches and agendas that are deemed to be inappropriate or not quite the right fit for the journal kinds of things sometimes. And then conferences determine inner circles, promote who gets heard, filtering ideas, and institutions where professional status is determined based on your affiliation or another like funding institution, filtering access to resources, establishing what gets funded, what doesn't. So this is the project that Edward was mentioning that we worked on with Peter Vickers, who was creating or has in mind this idea to create an institute for ascertaining scientific consensus. And this is just to emphasize this sort of interest in making known consensus views and finding a method to actually determine what those views are. So the way we did this was by emailing the people in various science departments around the world at different universities and having them answer, we just sort of did a test run so far, answer a question with regard to how much they, how strongly they endorse some view. So his whole, what I see to be Vickers' motivation for this is to be able to then share this information with the public and thus guide them towards making a decision that is based on scientific consensus with, say, regard to public health. So 95% of scientists believe, say, I mean, this isn't the specific example, that you should be vaccinated for COVID-19 or you should get the new vaccination. That's the kind of thing that it is going to be generating ideally. So and yeah, so his interest is in allowing people to actually see clearly that there isn't all this disagreement is sort of the idea. Like that gets brushed under the rug, maybe oversimplified in ways, but not that the disagreement does not exist. But I find this important. I like the idea of learning what is a sort of collective shared belief, and how that might evolve over time, and using this kind of system as a way to trace historically how science develops, I think would be really cool. So that's sort of my motivation for joining in. And Francis Bacon, most people don't tend to think of him as having any kind of like wild, fringy type ideas or interests. He's very much considered like the father of science, and he's like very trusted. Part of my research has focused a lot on things that Bacon said that I think are just really exciting and cool and passed over, even in parts of his work that are very well read. Part of that is like he's kind of hard to interpret at times. But so this is a point he makes in the advancement of learning. He says, history of nature is of three sorts: of nature in course, of nature erring and varying, and of nature altered or wrought. And he says that is, nature in course is the history of creatures, nature erring or varying is the history of marvels, and nature altered or wrought is the history of arts, right? So actually using the information from history of creatures and history of marvels to manipulate the world around you such that, for example, you live forever. And that's actually in, at the end of one of his, forgetting which, I think Instauratio Magna, that this whole list of things that are like dreams for the future of like what we can do for humans. One of them being extending life, live, and not in these terms, but living forever, more or less. Lots of those have been accomplished. It's, I'll see if I can pull that up in a minute, or at the end, if anyone's interested. So the first of these, nature in course, right? Just the way nature, what I presume he means by this, based on other contexts in which he brings it up, is this sort of way in which we understand nature existing, creating, being normal, like just fitting the sort of expectations. And he says, the latter two are bandied so weakly and unprofitably as I am moved to note them as deficient. So this idea of understanding the way weird things happen, like, or when weird things happen, our studies and knowledge of the weirdnesses that don't exist are not very well laid out. And he says, I find no sufficient or competent collection of the works of nature which have digression and deflection from the ordinary course of generations, productions, and motions, whether they be singularities of place and region or strange events, the effects of yet unknown properties, instances of exception to general kinds. It's true that I find a number of books of fabulous experiments and secrets, but a substantial and severe collection of the heteroclites or irregulars of nature, well examined and described, I find not. So I was pretty excited when I remembered that he said this, just in light of this being sort of exactly the same motivations I'm having behind wanting there to be a more extensive collection of information that is freely available and freely contributed to. So this is one of the famous quotes from him. The use of this work, of laying all this out, these three different histories of nature. The use of this work is that from the wonders of nature is the nearest intelligence and passage towards the wonders of art. so manipulation of things to get desired outcomes. For it is no more, but by following and, as it were, hounding nature in her wanderings, to be able to lead her afterwards to the same place again. And he says, neither am I of opinion in this history of marvels that superstitious narrations of sorceries, witchcrafts, dreams, divinations, and the like, where there is an assurance and clear evidence of the fact, be altogether excluded. So again, I am not of the opinion that superstitious narrations should be altogether excluded, which I don't know, it surprises some about Bacon. It's not really the way we think of him. But so for it is not yet known in what cases and how far effects attributed to superstition participate in natural causes. But from the speculation and consideration of them, light may be taken for the further disclosing of nature, right? So he wants to allow for, or he wants there to be records of, and, you know, literature available on the studies of these odd, unusual, strange phenomena that might be called superstitions or witchcraft. So, and not insofar as he thinks those are definitely real, he clarifies, but insofar as they might ultimately actually have something to show us with regard to how the world works. So it's just a list of just a few concerns that I see with consensus curation. So other than leaving out some unusual things that most people don't really mind leaving out, we've got the peer-reviewed journals, which, and an example I want to bring up is this case from the journal Anesthesia, that the editor found that when he had the raw data available, the submissions to that journal were very much either flawed, like fatally flawed, like not trustworthy, or otherwise faked. And like 25%, 24% were determined to be faked of the submissions, not of the accepted papers. However, when he did not have raw data available from the authors, he couldn't only tell something like 1% had any problems with regard to flaws in the data or flaws in or being fraudulent in some way. So what he called these were zombie trials. So here it says, more than 1/4 of a subset of manuscripts describing RCTs submitted to the journal Anesthesia, and anesthesia of all areas is a little disturbing, a pretty high risk area. So this is between 2017 and 2020, seem to be faked or fatally flawed when their raw data could be examined. But when their data could not be obtained, he only could label 1% as zombies. And so all kinds of retractions have happened in the past, few years, like increasing numbers of retractions are occurring of, quite reputable mainstream scholars who are well-known, respected amongst their peers. So I brought up consensus surveying, there being this sort of suppression of alternative approaches to a problem, and even from experts. And with COVID-19 is obviously the example everyone thinks about here, and one that is most fresh to me at least, is the sort of ways in which political polarization is actually allowing people to, or preventing people from being able to even ask questions, or even share information that seems to suggest that, say, maybe there's something other than vaccines people can do, or maybe things are more complicated in some way or another, right? That's just even bringing up the information that you might even find in a peer-reviewed journal can be really triggering, and even for me sometimes, right? Like it's just hard to not have a sort of emotional response when there's this sort of stigma attached to an idea. And just leads to overall the sort of promulgation of oversimplified narratives when presented to the public, and masking of any sort of even taken seriously disagreements within the culture. So I think one of the best examples is the theory that COVID was a lab leak, and actually knew a doctor here who thought early on that it was, and early on learned that he could not say that, even amongst his colleagues. And it was something like 3 years in before people actually started considering that something of a respectful position. And part of this too, right, is the sort of labels that get added to that, where it's like, you're racist if you think that, because that means you think Chinese scientists are messy or something, right? Like this, and that just automatically like stigmatizes, prevents people from being able to actually do real research in a way that is at least out loud. So he was like hiding his ideas, felt like he had to hide his ideas and not be sharing them publicly in order to preserve his career. So examples like that are what I'm referring to with this oversimplified narratives that come out of the sort of consensus curating approach. Okay. So another part of what I've been thinking about in relation to, just to reflect back again on RCTs, is the sort of various biases on limitations that RCTs can be sort of crippled by. And one of the greatest being the pharmaceutical funding of trials of the pharmaceutical company's drug that they are hoping to provide. And so there's sort of views saying pharmaceutical companies should have no role in testing their drugs because of the bias that ends up resulting from their handiwork. And a recent like 2020 data showed that the clinical trials with pharmaceutical funding were something 3 to 4 times more likely than all other clinical trials to produce a positive result. Which, maybe that's just because people who own a pharmaceutical company have enough money to like make sure they're doing the research and like figuring out the mechanisms for how this drug is going to work really well. And like, so that's why they're getting positive results. But of course, there's also the concern that the null or negative results are being just sort of shoved under the rug. And probably some of you know that there's this whole sort of movement towards creating a registry for studies prior to actually digging up any or obtaining any data. So, choosing and being clear about before the study, not tinkering with things after, right? Who qualifies, who's going to be part of who's going to be the subjects, how many people, how long it will last, which, a lot of limitations have been going on with like trouble having actual long-term, learning about long-term effects of medical interventions. Like the dosage, like what's the dosage that's going to be given? What's it going to be? What's the control? Is there a control? What's it being weighed against? Is it being actually weighed against something that is worth weighing it against? So a lot of that doesn't come out when you even just read an abstract. And a lot of people tend to get information from, reading a lot of abstracts or looking briefly at papers without really scrutinizing what's actually going on in the study, or worrying about, is this population actually representative of the population I want it to apply to? Like, is this a study that's just like, done at a private school where kids are getting enough attention, and 75% men and white, and now I want to like give this, now I want to give Adderall to my patient, and I'm trying to figure out, and if I don't look to see those details that, oh, these people who are my patients are not represented in this population, right? And this gets called like external validity. Then how do I actually end up getting the right information and treating my patients well? So all kinds of limitations. I'm not going to get into too much detail here. So that's sort of medicine part. I do like very general philosophy of science. I've been doing a lot of medicine stuff lately, and I do think medicine is very important with regard to developing something like a social media archive for science information or personal information about, how are you feeling like 5 years after you took that drug? Um, and but one thing to that I like to think about is Hatzok Chang's Forgotten Anomalies from the History of Physics. He talks about like the reflection of cold and the variations in the boiling point of water, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So, I mean, he has, and much of his work dug up what he calls lost facts or lost ideas or ways of understanding the data. So, and this, and as water H2O, he talks a lot about like phlogiston being actually having been a legitimate approach to understanding chemistry, and it actually giving us a lot of information, and information we might have gotten sooner had we not just sort of thrown it out when we found oxygen theory to be so successful. So, I mean, the whole sort of point being, just to summarize, I didn't highlight this well. There's certain ideas and questions, basically, he thinks too, that like have to be suppressed in order for science to go on, as generally the way we think of things. He, of course, thinks there are other ways in which to expand the set of questions and approaches that we have available. And in order for things to not get passed over or missed or forgotten, he thinks that we could be working in tandem with scientists to like recover these useful ideas and lost facts in the record of past science, exploring alternative conceptual systems. So I really like the way he looks backwards like into history to say like, this is not taken seriously anymore, right? Or we're not using this theory anymore, but maybe there is actually something to it, and maybe there's a good reason to like keep it on the table as something that is a sort of tool for inquiring. And there's really interesting like sort of analogies that take place between like the way we explain a certain phenomenon according to contemporary theory versus historical theory. One of my favorites is the miasma theory of disease, and this idea that diseases were spread by environmental factors like noxious airs emanating from swamps or sewage and things like this. And today people think that that's just like a silly kind of outrageous idea, not that sewage is like good for you or to be hanging out around, but that's not quite how disease transmission takes place according to current theories. So the case of the swamps emanating noxious airs and people surrounding swamps getting malaria, is explained according to miasma theory in terms of actually the bad air from those swamps is causing people to get sick, right? So what they did in order to reduce cases of malaria was drain the swamps. And that was efficacious. That was effective. The cases of malaria significantly went down because mosquitoes breed in standing water and mosquitoes carry malaria, according to contemporary theory, right? And so I find cases like this interesting where it's like, what is that? And then what does that mean about our current explanation and theory? Just looking like they did things right. There's a lot of things that worked from in miasma theory. And so what does that mean about the way we're thinking of something like no, this is a parasite that is specifically, carried by this mosquito, and it just, infects your body in this specific way. Like there being this whole mechanism that is the truth, or the best of our knowledge is, which is maybe a better way to put it. It just makes me wonder what is this sort of like a lens through which to work with the world rather than the truth. And of course, we're always seeing things from a human perspective. But what I like to add to the sort of forgotten anomalies or forgotten theories and ideas that were actually productive in the past is what I'm calling forward-looking anomalies. So these things that, we tend to just sort of brush under the rug again. And what ends up happening with relying solely on experts to provide us the information about the world surrounding us is their theories often constrict what you can actually perceive in your data, not just like an explanation. Like a lot of anomalies don't have an explanation, right? But there ends up being this sort of theory entrenchment of professional experts, and paired with having an expert-only information space, it's just a bit of a risk to stalling, scientific innovation and development. So I'm going to provide an example of a sort of perceptual deficit that I saw as arising from sort of unwavering theoretical expectations. Not that my example is of a physicist, Craig Boren, who works on atmospheric phenomena. And I had this experience of looking at just as a prism, the light cast by a prism that was hanging in my window, which, I love the color spectrum. But here's an image that I had taken. And when I first started showing him these images, the reason I contacted him is because this was in one of his papers as a color spectrum that he had artificially created using a sun or a light and reflecting into water, and cast this image. And he calls this a color spectrum, and this is how he describes it. This is what is seen: a white disk with its upper rim blue-violet and its lower rim red. And my concern about these images, I mean, maybe some of you, I have had people have no idea what I'm talking about here, and that's fine. He eventually saw what I was talking about. He doesn't say anything about like these little bits of green here. And he explains it in terms of, the sort of prevailing theory of refraction, and in terms of the blue light being refracted most and red light being refracted least. So he allows this thing he produced here to be called a color spectrum. However, when I showed him this and this, he called them metamers, which like overlapping colors of light, like in this case, red, green, and blue violet light will produce those colors you see in the overlaps, right? And that's just the label he gave them. And he got like so kind of frustrated by me saying it's just from a prism in my window, these images, and said, I need to see the exact details of your experimental setup. And I'm like, well, it's kind of just something I see every day with this thing hanging in my window. But ultimately, he ended up seeing the similarities between my image and his image in a way he could not prior. And I mean, the only reason I ever noticed this is I just randomly one day started tracing one of these images and saw, oh, these are like 3 overlapping disks. How weird. I didn't know that. Does anybody know that? Nobody talks about it. I've like searched the history of physics far back before Newton even, and have so far not found anyone mentioning it, right? Newton has his, I think, 6 or 7 different circles of light being cast from a prism. But here, it seems to me that we have 3 circles that have overlaps. And I find that fascinating. I have no idea what that means or whether it's meaningful in any way ever, but it's just the kind of thing where he could not see in his image that there was any green. He's like, no, what are you talking about? There's no green. Like, this isn't metamers, this is a color spectrum. But ultimately he did concede, but he also did not have anything much to say about it. One thing I find interesting is the sort of light cones in our eyes actually pick up the 3 colors that you see here. Like are specifically like photosensitive to red wavelengths roughly, green wavelengths roughly, and blue violet wavelengths roughly. Again, don't know what that means, but it's something that like I would love people to think about and talk about. I would, if anybody has any information or knows anyone who has talked about this, I would love to learn. So basically, what I'm suggesting is to create a sort of system of what I think is most easily could be a sort of web-based platform that is similar to Reddit in the sense of like allowing anyone to contribute things and people to like have sort of get information from individuals that they know are just, random individuals. But have it be something that is more organized, indexed, that could actually create outputs based on individuals' inputs. So I've called this a World Wide Web of frameworks. So frameworks from people all over the world, their ways of seeing or explaining the experiences they've had. And so I've called it Frame World here. This is just a little graphic of the sort of idea here, a social media web-based science platform where individuals can freely opt in and share their observations and the frameworks used to conceptualize and explain those observations. Or so maybe there'd be like an observation archive where you like input your first person experiences. And then another sort of layer where you can then offer your sort of the ways you've conceptualized or explained the framework you've used to try to understand these if you have one, or the questions you have. So my thought about this, the thing that I'm exploring is this sort of universally welcoming, just like opt-in, freely opt-in platform for science where it's like welcomes individuals to freely share those firsthand experiences. And I'll talk a little bit about firsthand experiences and the value of testimony and anecdotes, because we tend to think that stuff is, not particularly trustworthy or reliable in terms of science. And then also to provide their sort of whatever the information is they're willing to provide, their demographic information or other identifying information in the context of these different observations they've made. And then from there, the system, once there were inputs, could generate outputs, like the specific levels of personal data provided by an individual might say, this is just my first thought about it, is that like that might determine what the type of data you're allowed to generate from the system. So if you don't provide your demographic information, maybe you don't get to see the demographic information that, is in the system or something. I don't know how it would quite work, but I do think it's important to have people be free to share or not share what they want to share. And the importance of having the demographic information being things like, this is a system that could spit out statistics like 95% of MDs believe that you should get the vaccine. Like, that's the kind of idea that is the basic idea underlying this. So as I mentioned, including a medicine or public health portal, generating health statistics in context. And something I have in mind too is like some kind of way of matching, having like an interface between theories and the data available in the database, such that you could sort of see what are the pieces of data that are aligning with my theory, and where is it having trouble dealing with some piece of data. I know it sounds a bit fantastical. I don't think we're too far off with all the developments in AI, and I think it would be maybe a more a safer way to use AI than many other things. So of course we have various archives that are more open access these days, like the physics archive, PhilSci archive. So I just want to sort of consider an objection in terms of my point that there is an epistemic value to be gained from widespread first-person experience reports, anecdotal reports, and this idea that those should be included in archive of science. So, people tend to say they're unreliable, of course, maybe from one individual, difficult to reproduce, of course. Giant squid were thought to be sort of hallucinations for centuries, I believe. And hard to actually corroborate because they're not easy creatures to find. So the point being, like, anecdotal evidence can sometimes be attributed to hallucination, delusion, or perhaps even just attention seeking, interest in, getting somebody to buy their book. That's sort of the story that I most often hear as against any trust in first-person experience. I mean, how many people have seen like a UFO, UAP type phenomenon? And I mean, it doesn't matter how many there are, it seems. It's just always going to be this one person said this, and what am I going to do with that? It's hard to trust, a few people who seem to be part of a community and have maybe other interests they aren't sharing. So part of what I find really cool is the way that cross-cultural or historical sets of reports from many, many individuals and groups who are independent of one another can, like, unbeknownst to one another, share the same type of story with the same conceptual details, and that the ways that can sort of increase or draw interest, at least, increase credibility or potential credibility of actually looking into a phenomenon that is not generally taken seriously. So this is something that is pretty extreme in terms of the fringe status, I would say. Remote viewing. I don't know if people are familiar with this. So remote viewing is this practice that actually originates with some CIA documents that were declassified, where they were using individuals to gain information about something happening somewhere else. So simply giving these people coordinates for a location and having them do this sort of meditation practice and try to see from a distance what was going on, what was going on in this area. And it's actually really pretty mind-blowing the way this works, and it's hard to really say how this ends up working, but when that data converges, when all these like little concepts get put together, you end up getting a lot of overlapping information, or you end up having these sort of concept clusters that can work in support of a scientific discovery. And one of the most explicit examples of this is this guy, Robert Schwartz, who is not an archaeologist himself, does, I believe, have a PhD in psychology, but I'm not entirely remembering. But he helped an archaeologist using his teams of remote viewers find Columbus's lost ships, using this sort of analysis of the sort of drawings or responses he got, like finding the overlaps between them and using that information, all of these different reports combined to, come up with a picture that was, where are these reports actually converging? So that's an extreme case. That's actually a real case. You might have other ways of dismissing whether that actually contributed. It was just coincidence. They just happened to, land on it. So, I mean, the whole point being something like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, they say, and I would not deny that is true. But without something with something like a database that every individual can contribute their first person reports to, that does become extraordinary evidence, or could potentially at least become extraordinary evidence in cases. So some thoughts, just things that are already kind of emerging on the table with regard to the future of using such first-person experiences reports in combination. There's near-death experience studies that are starting to emerge in more mainstream type journals. So there's this fascinating convergence of reports from patients and emergency medical teams. Most notably, there's like some surgeons really trying to get this out, where they've been stunned by the accuracy of patients recalling odd and unpredictable circumstances that occur while they're in cardiac arrest. So seeing something going on in the room that you shouldn't have been able to see, or something going on in the hallway you shouldn't have been able to see, and having independent corroboration of that event having taken place while you were actually pronounced dead. And then the other aspect to this is the convergence across millennia, across cultures, of the different features that are very common in near-death experiences. And of course, you can attribute some of that stuff to, sort of universal psychology or something like this. But this researcher, Bruce Grayson, is trying to come up with these different approaches to explaining these phenomena. But one of the examples he gives here is a so many of these people reporting, including medical teams reporting, a patient, this really happened. A patient really was pronounced dead and then reported something that happened in the room while they were not there. That was completely bizarre, unlikely thing to be able to predict. Like the example he gives here is the plaid, including perceptions of very unlikely objects, such as the plaid shoelaces of a nurse who was present only during the patient's resuscitation and not before or after, and a cardiac surgeon flapping his arms as if trying to fly during an operation. So patients being out of body and reporting these things. And this just, if we could just have like all of those reports that people are making, medical teams or surgeons or maybe patients themselves and their, the brother that they saw in the hallway while they were pronounced dead, if we could actually combine all that information, have it in one place and be able to look at that, we might have a sort of different experience of judging the credibility of these phenomena. So some other more milder things here that I think could help with, that a database could help with, is the identification of unexpected confounding variables. So the example I gave here is a significant correlation between geographic latitude and cases of Parkinson's, or a correlation between having grown up in a culture that is accepting of some kind of alternative intervention, medical intervention, and the efficacy of that intervention, whether or not the person actually believes that the intervention is going to work. Like things like that are things we could be exploring if we just had people inputting their information freely and openly and allowed to, and have it organized in a system. Another thing is enabling longitudinal clinical studies, which are really hard to come by. Many of RCTs fail to account for the long-term effects of interventions, which, easy inputs into the database might support. And another important thing I think would be just sort of a very easy way to correct for some confirmation biases. I mean, particularly in this case, I'm thinking of regarding medicine, where, something like pharmaceutical funding biases that actually do skew the results might be easily exposed as, individual patients are actually providing their experiences of having taken that medication and, had XYZ experience, had these side effects and so on. And, once you get a bunch of people doing that, I think the information space could look really cool. And I do think it would be a really fun thing to explore if we can figure out how to do this. So thank you, everyone.
We'll take a 2-minute break and we'll have plenty of time for questions.